The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Montecito as Meghan Markle stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of their sprawling mansion, watching Archie chase butterflies across the perfectly maintained lawn. The California sunshine should have brought her peace, but today it felt different. Something in the air carried an electric tension that made her skin prickle with unease. Harry had been unusually quiet during breakfast, pushing his eggs around his plate while scrolling through his phone with an intensity that spoke of something far more serious than checking social media. When she had asked about his plans for the day, he had mumbled something about calls with London and disappeared into his study, leaving behind only the lingering scent of his cologne and an atmosphere thick with unspoken secrets. 3,000 miles away, in the grand corridors of Buckingham Palace, King Charles III was experiencing his own moment of quiet reflection. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, had settled upon his shoulders with increasing heaviness over the past months. The ongoing tensions within the royal family had reached a breaking point that demanded action, even if that action might fracture relationships beyond repair. The king stood in his private study, surrounded by portraits of monarchs past, their painted eyes seeming to judge his every decision. The red leather dispatch boxes that had once belonged to his mother sat unopened on his mahogany desk, their contents waiting while he wrestled with a choice that would define his reign and potentially destroy his relationship with his younger son forever. Charles had spent the previous evening in deep consultation with his most trusted advisors, including Sir Clive Alderton, his private secretary, and a small circle of constitutional experts who understood the delicate balance between tradition and the modern demands placed upon the monarchy. The solution they had proposed was elegant in its simplicity, devastating in its implications, and absolutely necessary for the survival of the institution he had sworn to protect. The Highgrove Accord, as they had come to call it in hushed tones, was named after Charles's beloved country estate where he had done some of his deepest thinking about the future of the monarchy. It was there, among his organic gardens and sustainable farming projects, that the king had first articulated his vision for a streamlined royal family that could weather the storms of the 21st century. The accord itself was a private family agreement, one that would never see the light of day in official documents or parliamentary records. It was an understanding between father and son, reached through careful negotiation and painful compromise, that would reshape the line of succession in ways that the public would never fully comprehend. At its core, the agreement addressed the fundamental question that had plagued the royal family since Harry and Meghan's explosive departure: what role, if any, should they play in the future of the monarchy? The answer, as Charles saw it, required sacrifice from both sides and a clear understanding of where loyalties must ultimately lie. In Montecito, Harry emerged from his study looking as though he had aged several years in the span of a few hours. His usually bright demeanor had been replaced by something darker, more complicated. Meghan noticed immediately how his shoulders sagged with the weight of whatever conversation had just concluded, how his hands shook slightly as he reached for the coffee mug she offered him. The call with his father had lasted nearly 2 hours, conducted in the formal tones that had replaced their once easy familial warmth. Charles had presented the terms of the accord with the measured precision of a seasoned diplomat, each word carefully chosen to minimize emotional impact while maximizing legal clarity. The king had begun by acknowledging the pain that had marked their relationship over the past several years, the misunderstandings and hurt feelings that had driven a wedge between them. He spoke of his love for Harry, his desire to find a path forward that honored both family bonds and constitutional requirements. But, beneath the paternal warmth lay an ultimatum disguised as an invitation. Harry would be welcome to return to his royal duties, Charles explained, but only under very specific conditions. He would need to separate from certain influences that the palace deemed incompatible with royal service. He would need to recommit fully to the institution, accepting that his primary loyalty must be to the crown rather than to any individual relationships or commercial ventures. The terms were presented as a generous offer, a chance for redemption and return to the fold. But Harry understood immediately what his father was really asking: choose between your wife and your birthright, between the life you have built and the life you were born to lead. The conversation had continued with Charles outlining the practical details of what a return would entail. Harry would resume his military patronages, take on a more prominent role in royal ceremonies, and be granted increased financial support from the Duchy of Cornwall. In return, he would agree to limit his public speaking engagements, submit all media appearances to palace approval, and maintain a primary residence within the United Kingdom. Most significantly, and most devastatingly, Harry would need to accept that any future children would be raised primarily in Britain, educated in traditional royal institutions, and prepared for lives of service to the crown. The implication was clear: Meghan's influence over their children's upbringing would be significantly curtailed, her American perspectives and modern approach to parenting deemed incompatible with royal expectations. As Harry had listened to his father's carefully constructed proposal, he felt the familiar tug of conflicting loyalties that had plagued him since childhood. Part of him longed for the simplicity of returning to royal life, for the clear sense of purpose and belonging that came with serving the crown. The military ceremonies, the charitable work, the feeling of being part of something larger than himself, these aspects of royal life had always called to him in ways that his civilian existence in California never quite could. But another part of him, the part that had been transformed by love and fatherhood and the hard-won independence of his American exile, recoiled at the terms his father presented. The idea of asking Meghan to sacrifice her autonomy, her career, her very identity for the sake of royal protocol felt like a betrayal of everything they had fought to achieve together. Charles had sensed his son's hesitation and had pressed his advantage with the skill of a monarch who had spent decades navigating complex political negotiations. He spoke of duty and legacy, of the special burden that came with royal birth and the responsibility to future generations. He reminded Harry of the military motto that had once guided his life: service before self. The king also painted a picture of what rejection of the accord would mean. Without a clear path back to royal life, Harry would remain in a state of permanent exile, neither fully royal nor fully civilian. His children would grow up disconnected from their British heritage, their royal titles gradually fading in relevance as they built lives outside the monarchy's protective embrace. More pointedly, Charles suggested that continued estrangement would make any future reconciliation increasingly unlikely. The wounds between them would only deepen with time, the gulf widening until it became unbridgeable. This was perhaps the last opportunity for a genuine restoration of their father-son relationship, the final chance to heal the rifts that had torn their family apart. As the call neared its conclusion, Charles had played his most powerful card. He spoke of his own mortality, of the reality that he was no longer a young man and that time was running short for healing old wounds. He wanted to leave behind a united family, a monarchy prepared for the challenges ahead. He could not do that if his son remained estranged, if his grandchildren grew up as strangers to their British heritage. Harry had felt the weight of that emotional appeal, the pull of filial obligation that ran deeper than rational thought. Despite everything that had happened between them, Charles remained his father, the man who had raised him after his mother's death, who had tried in his own imperfect way to prepare him for a life of service. In the end, it was that paternal bond that proved decisive. With reservations and conditions of his own, Harry had agreed to the basic framework of the Highgrove Accord. He would explore the possibility of returning to royal life, would discuss the terms with Meghan, and would work toward a resolution that honored both family loyalty and personal integrity. But, even as he made that commitment, Harry knew that he was walking into a minefield of competing loyalties and impossible choices. The agreement he had reached with his father was just the beginning of a much more complex negotiation, one that would test his marriage, his principles, and his understanding of what it truly meant to be both a royal and a husband. Now, as he faced the prospect of explaining the accord to Meghan, Harry felt the full weight of the decision he had made. He had agreed to something that would fundamentally alter their life together, something that challenged the very foundations of the partnership they had built in their Montecito exile. The California sunshine that had once symbolized their freedom from royal constraints now seemed to mock him with its cheerful brightness. Soon, he would have to tell the woman he loved that he had agreed to terms that might require them to surrender the independence they had fought so hard to achieve. In the distance, Archie's laughter echoed across the garden, a sound of pure joy that reminded Harry of everything he stood to lose or gain depending on the choices he made in the coming weeks. The Highgrove Accord had set in motion a chain of events that would test every relationship in his life, starting with the most important one of all. The late afternoon breeze carried the scent of eucalyptus through the open windows as Meghan finished her virtual meeting with the Archwell Foundation Board. The quarterly review had gone well, with promising updates on their various charitable initiatives, but she found it difficult to concentrate fully. Harry's strange mood throughout the day had left her feeling unsettled, like a storm was approaching despite the clear California sky. When she finally emerged from her home office, she found Harry in their living room, staring out at the Pacific Ocean in the distance. His posture spoke of deep contemplation, the kind of brooding intensity she had learned to recognize during their courtship and early marriage. It was the same look he wore when wrestling with decisions that touched on his royal heritage, when the past and present collided in ways that left him feeling torn between two worlds. Harry turned as she approached, and Meghan immediately noticed the conflict in his green eyes. There was love there, as always, but also something that looked suspiciously like guilt. Her stomach tightened with a familiar anxiety, the same feeling she had experienced during their darkest days as working royals when palace politics and family drama threatened to overwhelm their relationship. The conversation that followed would later be remembered by both of them as one of the most difficult they had ever shared. Harry began tentatively, explaining about the unexpected call from his father, the lengthy discussion about the future of their family's relationship with the monarchy. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who knew that every phrase might be scrutinized and remembered. Meghan listened with growing alarm as Harry outlined the basic terms of what Charles was calling the Highgrove Accord. The more he explained about expectations for their return to royal duties, about limitations on their independence and autonomy, about the implications for their children's future, the more she felt her carefully constructed new life beginning to crumble around the edges. When Harry reached the part about potentially relocating to Britain, about submitting to palace oversight of their public appearances and business ventures, Meghan felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. This was everything they had left behind, everything they had fought to escape when they made their dramatic exit from royal life. The very freedoms they had sacrificed so much to achieve were being offered back to them at a price that felt impossibly steep. Meghan's initial response was measured, controlled in the way she had learned to be during her years as a working royal when every emotion was scrutinized and analyzed by the media. She asked clarifying questions about the specific terms, about timelines and expectations. But, beneath her calm exterior, a storm was building that would soon prove impossible to contain. The breaking point came when Harry mentioned the implications for Archie and Lilibet's upbringing. The idea that their children might be expected to conform to rigid royal protocols, that their education and cultural formation might be subject to palace approval, struck at the very core of Meghan's identity as a mother and as an independent woman who had fought too hard for her own voice to watch her children's voices be silenced. The argument that erupted was unlike anything they had experienced in their marriage. Meghan's fury was not the hot, explosive kind that burns out quickly, but rather the cold, sustained anger of someone who feels fundamentally betrayed. She spoke with the precision of a trained actress who knew how to project emotion and meaning, but the feelings behind her words were devastatingly real. She reminded Harry of everything they had endured during their time as working royals, the racist coverage in the British press, the lack of support from palace officials, the isolation and mental health struggles that had brought her to the brink of despair. She spoke of the suicide ideation that had nearly destroyed her, of the ways the institution had failed to protect her and their children from attacks that went far beyond normal public scrutiny. Harry found himself in the impossible position of defending an agreement he was not entirely sure he supported while trying to maintain loyalty to both his father and his wife. He spoke of family obligation, of the possibility that things might be different this time, of his own desire to repair relationships that had been damaged by years of conflict and misunderstanding. But, even as he made these arguments, Harry could hear the weakness in his own voice. The truth was that he had been swayed by his father's emotional appeal, by the prospect of healing wounds that had festered for too long. He had agreed to terms without fully considering how they would impact the woman who had transformed his understanding of what love and partnership could mean. Meghan's response cut through his rationalizations with surgical precision. She spoke of patterns of behavior within the royal family, of the ways that women who challenged traditional expectations were consistently undermined and marginalized. She pointed out that the very terms of the accord demonstrated that nothing had fundamentally changed within the institution, that the same attitudes and assumptions that had made their previous royal life untenable remained firmly in place. The conversation continued late into the evening, moving from their living room to their garden and back again as they tried to find common ground on what seemed like an unbridgeable divide. Harry found himself caught between two competing visions of their future, one that honored his royal heritage and family obligations, another that preserved the independence and authenticity they had worked so hard to achieve in America. Meghan, meanwhile, was grappling with a sense of betrayal that went deeper than the specific terms of the accord. The fact that Harry had engaged in such significant negotiations without her input felt like a fundamental violation of the partnership they had built together. It reminded her of the ways that royal protocol had consistently relegated her to a supporting role, even in decisions that affected her own life and the lives of their children. As the night wore on, their discussion began to reveal underlying tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface of their California contentment. Harry's ongoing struggle with his identity outside the royal system, his occasional nostalgia for the military camaraderie and clear sense of purpose that had defined his younger years. Meghan's determination never again to subject herself or her children to the kind of systematic diminishment she had experienced during her brief tenure as a working royal. The accord had forced them to confront questions they had been avoiding since their departure from Britain. What did they really want their future to look like?
How much were they willing to sacrifice for the sake of family harmony? Could they find a way to honor Harry's royal heritage without compromising Meghan's hard-won independence and their children's right to choose their own paths? By the early hours of the morning, they had reached a fragile agreement to sleep on the decision, to give themselves time to process the emotional intensity of the evening's revelations. But both knew that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. The Highgrove Accord had introduced a wedge between them that would not be easily removed. Meghan lay awake long after Harry had fallen into an exhausted sleep, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with the implications of what had been set in motion. She thought about the life they had built in Montecito, the carefully constructed independence that had allowed them to pursue meaningful work while protecting their children from the harsh glare of royal scrutiny. She thought about the business partnerships they had cultivated, the creative projects that were beginning to bear fruit, the sense of autonomy that had slowly healed the wounds inflicted by their traumatic exit from royal life. All of this would be at risk if they accepted the terms of Charles's proposal. But she also thought about Harry, about the man she had fallen in love with who carried within him a deep sense of duty and loyalty that could not be easily dismissed. She understood his desire to heal relationships with his family, his ongoing guilt about the pain their departure had caused. She recognized that his royal heritage was not something he could simply discard, no matter how much conflict it caused in their present circumstances. The next morning brought no easy answers, only a deeper understanding of the complexity of their situation. Harry woke to find Meghan already dressed and preparing for a long walk along the beach, her way of processing difficult emotions and finding clarity in physical movement. Their breakfast was subdued, marked by the careful politeness of people who love each other but are struggling to find common ground. Harry attempted several times to restart their conversation from the previous night, but Meghan was not ready to engage. She needed time to think, to consider all the implications of what Charles was proposing. Throughout the day, Meghan found herself remembering specific moments from their time as working royals, the feeling of being constantly watched and judged, the way her words were twisted and misinterpreted by a hostile media, the isolation that came from being surrounded by people who viewed her as an outsider who had somehow infiltrated their exclusive world. She remembered the relief she had felt when they finally made the decision to step back from royal duties, the sense of freedom that had come with no longer having to perform a role that felt fundamentally inauthentic to who she was. The idea of voluntarily returning to that environment, even under supposedly improved conditions, felt like a betrayal of her own hard-won wisdom about what she needed to thrive. But she also remembered the Harry she had first fallen in love with, the prince who spoke passionately about service and duty, who found genuine joy in his royal engagements and military connections. She had watched him struggle with his identity outside the royal system, had seen how their California exile, for all its benefits, had also left him searching for a sense of purpose that remained elusive. As the day progressed, Meghan began to formulate her own response to the Highgrove Accord, one that would honor her love for Harry while protecting her own integrity and their children's future. She would not simply reject Charles's proposal outright, but neither would she accept terms that felt like a fundamental compromise of everything they had fought to achieve. The stage was set for a negotiation that would test every aspect of their relationship while determining the future course of their lives together. 3 days passed in tense silence between Harry and Meghan, each of them processing the implications of the Highgrove Accord in their own way. The normally comfortable rhythm of their Montecito life had been disrupted by an undercurrent of unspoken tension that affected everything from their morning coffee routine to their evening conversations with the children. Harry spent most of his time in his study, fielding calls from London that Meghan could hear through the closed door. The conversation seemed to grow more intense with each passing day, voices raised in frustration or dropped to urgent whispers depending on who was on the other end of the line. She recognized the tone of palace staff when they spoke to Harry, respectful but insistent, always pushing for decisions and commitments that served the institution rather than the individual. On the fourth morning, Meghan made a decision that would change the trajectory of their crisis. Instead of continuing to avoid the subject or waiting for Harry to initiate another difficult conversation, she took control of the situation in the way that had always served her best, through direct action and clear communication. She arranged for Archie and Lilibet to spend the day with their nanny at a nearby children's museum, giving her and Harry the privacy they needed for what she knew would be a marathon discussion. Then, she prepared what she privately called her counter-proposal, a detailed response to Charles's accord that addressed every point while establishing her own non-negotiable boundaries. When Harry emerged from his study that afternoon, looking haggard from another lengthy call with his father's private secretary, he found Meghan waiting for him in their living room with a formal document spread across the coffee table. Her demeanor was calm but determined, the same energy she had brought to challenging royal protocols during their brief time as working members of the firm.
The document Meghan had prepared was thorough and legally precise, drawing on her background in international relations and her hard-earned understanding of how palace negotiations actually worked. She had structured it as a formal response to the Highgrove Accord, point by point addressing each of Charles's proposals while offering her own alternative framework for any future royal engagement. Her counter-proposal began with a fundamental reframing of the entire discussion. Rather than accepting the premise that they needed to choose between complete estrangement and full return to royal duties, Meghan outlined a third path that preserved their independence while allowing for limited royal engagement on terms that respected their autonomy as adults and as parents. She proposed a system of selective royal duties that would be negotiated on a case-by-case basis, allowing Harry to participate in military ceremonies and charitable events that aligned with their values while maintaining their right to decline engagements that conflicted with their other commitments or principles.
This approach would give them flexibility to honor Harry's heritage without surrendering their hard-won independence. On the crucial issue of their children's upbringing, Meghan's response was uncompromising.
Archie and Lilibet would be raised primarily in California, with summers spent in Britain to maintain connections to their royal heritage. Their education would be determined by their parents, not by palace protocol, and they would have the right to choose their own level of engagement with royal duties when they came of age. The financial aspects of Meghan's counter-proposal were particularly clever, drawing on her understanding of both American business culture and royal funding mechanisms. Rather than accepting direct financial support from the Duchy of Cornwall, which would come with strings attached, she proposed a foundation partnership that would allow the royal family to support their charitable work without creating financial dependence or obligation. Harry read through Meghan's document with growing admiration for her strategic thinking, but also with a sinking realization of how far apart their position was from what his father was likely to accept. The palace had made it clear that they were offering a take-it-or-leave-it proposition, not the opening move in a lengthy negotiation process. When Harry shared this concern, Meghan's response revealed the steel beneath her diplomatic language. She had anticipated the palace's resistance to negotiation and had prepared accordingly. If Charles was unwilling to consider alternative arrangements, then they would proceed with their current life in California without looking back. But if he truly wanted to heal the family rift, he would need to demonstrate that flexibility and respect that had been lacking in their previous royal experience. The conversation that followed was markedly different from their heated exchange 3 nights earlier. This time, they were working together to analyze a complex problem rather than arguing from opposing positions. Harry found himself impressed by Meghan's thorough preparation and strategic thinking, while Meghan appreciated Harry's insider knowledge of how palace politics actually functioned. Together, they refined Meghan's counter-proposal, with Harry suggesting modifications based on his understanding of what might be palatable to the palace while Meghan insisted on maintaining the core principles that would make any agreement sustainable for their family. The process of collaboration helped to heal some of the wounds from Harry's unilateral decision to engage with his father without consulting her first. By evening, they had crafted a response that felt authentic to their values while remaining respectful of Harry's family relationships. But both knew that presenting this counter-proposal to Charles would likely precipitate a crisis that could permanently damage Harry's relationship with his father and brother. The call to London was scheduled for the following morning, giving Harry one final night to reconsider his decision to challenge his father's terms. He spent the evening walking through their garden, weighing the competing claims of family loyalty and personal integrity, of tradition and innovation, of duty to the crown and responsibility to his wife and children. Meghan, meanwhile, was already preparing for the possibility that Charles would reject their counter-proposal entirely. She reached out to their legal team to ensure that their current business arrangements were protected against any potential royal retaliation. She also began making contingency plans for increased security, knowing that their decision to resist palace pressure might result in negative media coverage or worse. The next morning arrived with the kind of brilliant California sunshine that had initially attracted them to Montecito, but neither Harry nor Meghan felt the usual lift in spirits that came with perfect weather. They knew they were about to embark on a confrontation that would determine not only their relationship with the royal family but also their own future together. Harry made the call from his study while Meghan waited in their kitchen, occupying herself with preparations for Archie's birthday party the following weekend. The normalcy of planning a children's party felt surreal given the magnitude of what was being decided in the next room, but it also served as a reminder of what they were fighting to protect. The conversation with King Charles began with the formal courtesies that had replaced genuine warmth in their father-son relationship. But it quickly became apparent that Charles had been expecting Harry's complete acceptance of the Highgrove Accord, not a detailed counter-proposal that challenged many of his fundamental assumptions about royal duty and family loyalty.
Charles's initial response was one of disappointment rather than anger.
He had genuinely believed that his offer represented a generous path back to royal life, one that acknowledged Harry's desire for some independence while maintaining the institution's need for loyalty and predictability. The idea that his son would respond with demands and conditions felt like a rejection of the olive branch he had extended. Harry found himself once again caught between competing loyalties, but this time he was better prepared for the emotional manipulation that had proven so effective in their previous conversation. Meghan's counterproposal had given him a framework for resistance, a way to honor his love for his father while protecting his marriage and his children's future. The conversation grew increasingly tense as Charles realized that Harry was not simply negotiating details but challenging the fundamental premise of royal duty that had guided the family for generations. The king began to speak of disappointed expectations, of the special burdens that came with royal birth, of Harry's obligation to put family and country ahead of personal desires. But Harry had heard these arguments before, had lived with their weight throughout his childhood and young adulthood. This time, he had something to counterbalance them, a clear vision of what he wanted his life to look like and a partner who had shown him that love could exist without complete surrender of individual identity. When Charles finally realized that Harry was serious about his alternative proposal, the conversation took a darker turn. The king began to outline the consequences of continued estrangement, the ways that the royal family would need to protect itself from the unpredictability that Harry and Meghan represented. There were veiled threats about security arrangements, about access to royal events, about the future status of their children's titles. Harry listened to his father's warnings with a heavy heart but without wavering in his determination to protect what he had built with Meghan. He understood that they were crossing a line that might prove impossible to uncross, but he also knew that accepting Charles's original terms would require sacrifices that neither he nor Meghan could sustain over time. The call ended without resolution, with Charles requesting time to consider Harry's counterproposal while making it clear that significant modifications would be difficult if not impossible given the institutional constraints he faced as king. Both men knew they were approaching a point of no return in their relationship, but neither seemed able to find a path that preserved both family unity and individual integrity. When Harry emerged from his study, Meghan could read the outcome in his face before he said a word. The battle lines had been drawn, and they were now committed to a course of action that would test every aspect of their relationship while potentially severing Harry's ties to his birth family forever. The silence from London stretched on for 2 weeks, during which Harry and Meghan found themselves living in a strange state of suspended animation. Their daily routines continued, school runs with Archie, business meetings for their various ventures, quiet family dinners, but underneath it all was the awareness that their entire future hung in the balance of King Charles's decision about their counterproposal. During this waiting period, Meghan threw herself into her work with an intensity that served as both distraction and preparation. She scheduled additional meetings with their entertainment industry partners, accelerated development of several Archwell Foundation projects, and began exploring new business opportunities that would be completely independent of any royal connections. Her message was clear: they would thrive regardless of what Charles decided. Harry, meanwhile, struggled with a different kind of preparation. He found himself grieving the potential loss of relationships that had defined his identity since childhood, while also trying to remain hopeful that some form of compromise might still be possible. He spent long hours on the phone with mutual friends who served as informal intermediaries, trying to gauge whether there was any room for movement in the palace's position. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Princess Anne, known for her direct approach to family problems and her general impatience with palace drama, reached out directly to Harry with a proposal that circumvented the formal channels through which all previous communication had flowed. And had always maintained a complicated relationship with the younger generation of royals, often criticizing what she saw as their desire for the privileges of royal status without accepting its full responsibilities. But she had also watched with concern as the family fractures deepened, and she understood better than most the long-term institutional damage that could result from permanent estrangement. Her call to Harry was characteristically blunt. She outlined what she had observed from her position as one of the hardest-working members of the royal family. Charles was under enormous pressure from constitutional advisors who viewed any compromise with Harry and Meghan as a dangerous precedent that could embolden other royals to make similar demands for special treatment. At the same time, Anne revealed, there were growing concerns within the palace about the public relations implications of a permanent rift. Polling data showed that Harry remained popular with younger demographics, particularly in Commonwealth countries where his military service and charitable work had earned genuine respect. A complete estrangement could damage the monarchy's reputation at a time when it was already facing questions about its relevance in the modern world.
Anne's proposal was elegantly simple and devastatingly practical. Rather than trying to force Harry and Meghan back into traditional royal roles, why not create an entirely new category of royal engagement that acknowledged their unique circumstances while still providing value to the institution? She suggested a formal role as Commonwealth ambassadors, a position that would allow them to represent the monarchy at international events while maintaining their primary residence in California. This would give them the independence they valued while providing the palace with high-profile representatives who could connect with younger, more diverse audiences around the world. The beauty of Anne's proposal was that it addressed the core concerns of both sides without requiring either to completely abandon their principles. Harry and Meghan would have meaningful royal duties that utilized their particular strengths and experiences, while Charles could point to their service as evidence that family unity had been preserved. When Harry shared Anne's proposal with Meghan, her initial response was cautious but intrigued. The Commonwealth ambassador role would allow them to focus on the international charitable work they were already pursuing while adding the weight and access that came with official royal status. It was a role that could evolve over time, potentially becoming more substantial if the arrangement proved successful. More importantly, the proposal addressed Meghan's core concern about autonomy. As Commonwealth ambassadors based in California, they would have significant control over their schedule and priorities. They could choose which events to attend and which causes to champion, rather than being assigned duties by palace bureaucrats who might not understand or appreciate their perspectives. The role would also provide a natural bridge between their American life and Harry's British heritage, allowing their children to see their father serving the crown in a way that honored his background while respecting their own multicultural identity. Archie and Lilibet could grow up understanding their royal connections without being constrained by them. Harry and Meghan spent several days refining the Commonwealth ambassador proposal, drawing on their extensive experience in international relations and charitable work to outline specific duties and responsibilities. They proposed focusing on youth engagement, mental health initiatives, and sustainable development, areas where they had already established credibility and where their celebrity status could generate meaningful attention and support. They also suggested innovative approaches to royal engagement that would reflect their digital native perspective and international experience. Virtual reality documentaries about Commonwealth countries, social media campaigns to highlight success stories in sustainable development, partnerships with international organizations that could amplify the reach and impact of their work. The proposal they ultimately sent to London was comprehensive and professional, demonstrating that they had thought seriously about how to serve the monarchy while remaining true to their own values and priorities. It was a far cry from the emotional ultimatums that had characterized their previous negotiations, instead offering a practical framework for cooperation that could benefit all parties. Charles's response, when it came, was more positive than anyone had dared to hope. The king had consulted with senior advisors, Commonwealth leaders, and constitutional experts, all of whom saw potential value in the proposed arrangement. There were still details to be negotiated and protocols to be established, but the basic framework was acceptable to the palace. The negotiation process that followed was markedly different from the tense confrontations that had characterized their previous discussions. Working through and as an intermediary, both sides approached the conversation with a genuine desire to find common ground rather than to score points or establish dominance. Harry found himself cautiously optimistic about the possibility of maintaining meaningful connections to his royal heritage without sacrificing his marriage or his children's future. Meghan, while still wary of palace promises, began to see how the Commonwealth ambassador role could actually enhance their existing work rather than constraining it. The breakthrough came when Charles agreed to a trial period for the new arrangement. Rather than committing to a permanent change, they would test the Commonwealth ambassador model for 18 months, with both sides retaining the right to withdraw if the arrangement proved unworkable. This compromise addressed one of Meghan's key concerns about being trapped in a role that might prove as problematic as their previous royal duties. If the palace proved unable or unwilling to honor the spirit of their agreement, she and Harry could walk away without feeling they had broken formal commitments. For Charles, the trial period provided political cover with advisors who remained skeptical about any special arrangements for Harry and Meghan. If the Commonwealth ambassador role proved successful, it could be made permanent and, potentially, expanded. If it created problems, it could be quietly discontinued without major institutional damage. The final negotiations focused on practical details, travel budgets, security arrangements, communication protocols, and the delicate question of how to announce the new arrangement to the public without it appearing to be a capitulation to Harry and Meghan's previous demands. As the agreement took shape, both Harry and Meghan found themselves feeling something they had not experienced in relation to the royal family for years: genuine hope. They were not returning to their previous lives as working royals, but they were also not accepting permanent exile from Harry's heritage and family. The Commonwealth ambassador role offered something genuinely new, a way to serve the crown while maintaining the independence and authenticity that had become essential to their identity. It was not the traditional royal life that Charles might have preferred, nor was it the complete freedom from royal obligations that Meghan had initially sought. But it was a compromise that honored the legitimate needs and concerns of both sides. As they prepared to finalize the agreement, Harry and Meghan reflected on how far they had traveled from the angry confrontations and ultimatums that had marked the beginning of this process. They had learned to fight for their principles without destroying their relationships, to negotiate from strength rather than defensiveness, and to find creative solutions to problems that had initially seemed intractable. The Highgrove Accord had evolved into something none of them had initially envisioned, but perhaps that was exactly what made it sustainable. Instead of one side imposing its will on the other, they had crafted a new model for royal service that acknowledged the realities of the 21st century while preserving the essential elements of family unity and institutional continuity. 6 months after the Commonwealth Ambassador Agreement was finalized, Harry and Meghan stood on the balcony of Government House in Sydney, looking out over one of the most beautiful harbours in the world as they prepared for their first major overseas engagement in their new royal role. The Australian tour had been their idea, a way to test the new arrangement in a setting that held special significance for both of them and where they had previously experienced some of their most successful royal engagements. The months leading up to the tour had been a period of careful relationship rebuilding and gradual trust development. Charles had made good on his commitment to give them substantial autonomy in designing their Commonwealth ambassador duties, while Harry and Meghan had demonstrated their willingness to work within royal protocols when it served broader institutional interests. The trial period had not been without its challenges. There had been disagreements about security arrangements, tensions over media access, and ongoing debates about the scope of their independence. But both sides had approached these issues as problems to be solved rather than battles to be won, and they had developed increasingly effective mechanisms for communication and conflict resolution. Meghan had been particularly pleased with how the new arrangement had allowed them to integrate their existing charitable work with their royal duties. The Archwell Foundation's mental health initiatives had gained significant momentum when combined with the platform and access that came with official royal status, while their focus on sustainable development had aligned perfectly with Commonwealth priorities around climate change and economic development. The Australian tour was designed to showcase this integration of their personal passions with their royal responsibilities. Their itinerary included visits to mental health clinics that used innovative approaches to treating trauma and depression, sustainable farming operations that were pioneering new approaches to agriculture in a changing climate, and youth organizations that were creating opportunities for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Each engagement had been carefully planned to demonstrate how their celebrity status and royal connections could be used to generate genuine impact rather than simply providing photo opportunities. They had insisted on substantial time at each location, allowing for meaningful conversations and the kind of authentic interactions that had always been Harry's strength in royal engagements. The tour also marked a significant evolution in how they managed media coverage. Rather than relying entirely on traditional royal correspondence, they had negotiated the right to include independent journalists and social media content creators who could tell their story in ways that reached younger, more diverse audiences. This approach had initially raised eyebrows at the palace, but early coverage suggested it was succeeding in generating the kind of positive international attention that justified the innovation. On their third day in Sydney, Harry and Meghan participated in a roundtable discussion with Commonwealth leaders about youth mental health initiatives. The conversation was substantive and policy-focused, a far cry from the ceremonial appearances that had characterized much of their previous royal work. Meghan found herself drawing on her background in international relations while Harry contributed insights from his military experience and his own struggles with mental health. The success of these engagements was evident not only in media coverage but also in the feedback they were receiving from Commonwealth governments and international organizations. Several countries had already extended invitations for future visits, while the United Nations had approached them about serving as special ambassadors for specific sustainable development goals. Perhaps most importantly, the tour was demonstrating that the Commonwealth ambassador role could provide genuine value to the monarchy while allowing Harry and Meghan to maintain their authenticity and independence. They were representing the crown in a way that felt natural and sustainable, rather than trying to force themselves into traditional molds that had never quite fit. The personal dimension of their success was equally significant. Harry seemed more relaxed and confident than he had been since leaving his military career, energized by work that combined public service with personal meaning.
Meghan was thriving in a role that allowed her to use her communication skills and international perspective while working on issues she genuinely cared about. Their relationship, which had been strained by the months of uncertainty and negotiation around the Highgrove Accord, had emerged stronger and more resilient. They had learned to navigate the complex intersection of royal duty and personal autonomy, developing skills and frameworks that would serve them well in future challenges. Back in London, King Charles was receiving regular reports about the tour's success with a mixture of satisfaction and surprise. He had hoped that the Commonwealth ambassador arrangement would work, but the enthusiastic response from Commonwealth leaders and international media had exceeded his expectations. The tour was generating exactly the kind of positive coverage that the monarchy needed, particularly in younger demographics and diverse communities where royal relevance had been declining. Charles had also noticed changes in his relationship with Harry during their regular phone conversations about tour planning and logistics. The formal distance that had characterized their interactions since the original Highgrove negotiations had gradually given way to something more collaborative and respectful. They were working together as father and son, monarch and prince, in a way that honored both institutional needs and family bonds. The success of the Australian tour led to immediate discussions about expanding the Commonwealth ambassador model. Other working royals had begun expressing interest in similar arrangements that would give them more control over their duties while maintaining their service to the crown. Palace officials were quietly studying whether the flexibility that had proven successful for Harry and Meghan might be applicable to other members of the family facing similar challenges in balancing personal fulfillment with royal duty. On their final evening in Australia, Harry and Meghan attended a reception for young Commonwealth leaders at the British Consul General's residence. As they moved through the crowd, engaging in conversations about climate change, economic development, and social justice, both felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this point. The path from the angry confrontations over the original Highgrove Accord to this moment of successful royal service had been difficult and uncertain. There had been times when permanent estrangement seemed inevitable, when the gulf between their values and institutional expectations appeared unbridgeable. But they had found a way forward that honored both their commitment to each other and Harry's heritage as a member of the royal family. Meghan reflected on how different this experience was from her previous royal tours, when she had often felt like she was performing a role rather than engaging in meaningful work. The Commonwealth ambassador position allowed her to be authentically herself while serving something larger, to use her skills and platform in ways that generated real impact rather than simply fulfilling ceremonial obligations. Harry, meanwhile, was experiencing a sense of purpose and connection to his royal identity that he had not felt since his military service. The Commonwealth ambassador role gave him a way to honor his family's legacy while building something uniquely his own, to serve the crown in a manner that reflected his values and experiences rather than simply repeating traditional patterns. As their plane lifted off from Sydney for the long journey back to California, Harry and Meghan knew they had proven something important to themselves, to the royal family, and to the public watching their experiment with intense interest. They had demonstrated that royal service could evolve without losing its essential meaning, that tradition and innovation could coexist in ways that strengthened rather than weakened the institution. The Commonwealth ambassador model was no longer an experiment but a new template for royal engagement in the 21st century. Other members of the family were already discussing how they might adapt similar approaches to their own duties, while Commonwealth leaders were expressing enthusiasm for expanding the program to include other royals with relevant expertise and interests. Back in Montecito, as they settled into their familiar routines of school runs and family dinners, Harry and Meghan felt a deep sense of accomplishment that went beyond the success of any single tour or engagement. They had navigated one of the most challenging periods of their relationship and emerged with their marriage stronger, their values intact, and their royal connections restored in a form that served everyone involved. The Highgrove Accord had begun as King Charles's attempt to force a choice between royal duty and personal autonomy. Through months of difficult negotiation, creative problem-solving, and mutual compromise, it had evolved into something none of them had initially imagined, a new model for royal service that honored both tradition and innovation, both institutional needs and individual authenticity. As they tucked their children into bed that evening, Archie and Lilibet chattering excitedly about the photos and stories from Australia, Harry and Meghan knew they had succeeded in creating something precious and rare, a way to serve the crown while remaining true to themselves, to honor Harry's heritage while protecting their family's future, to bridge the divide between royal tradition and modern values in ways that strengthened both. The future remained unwritten, full of challenges and opportunities that would test the new arrangements they had built. But they faced that uncertainty with confidence born of having navigated impossible circumstances and found solutions that had seemed unimaginable when their crisis began. They had proven that love and loyalty, tradition and innovation, individual authenticity and institutional service could coexist when approached with creativity, patience, and genuine respect for all parties involved. The Highgrove Accord had become something far more valuable than anyone had initially envisioned, a blueprint for how the royal family could evolve to meet the challenges of the modern world while preserving the essential elements that gave the monarchy its enduring meaning and purpose.